In 1963, barely 10 years after the company was founded, Lotus won its first Formula One championship. Over the next 15 years, they won 6 more. On the most prestigious racetracks in the world, Lotus was a force to be reckoned with. But the road cars were not on the same level. At that moment, every Lotus road car had been available in affordable kit form for enterprising enthusiasts to assemble themselves, a far cry from the glamorous road cars of, say, their on-track rival Ferrari. The Esprit changed all that. Coupling spectacular wedgy Italian styling with a very modern powertrain and a wonderful chassis, the Esprit put Lotus on a new trajectory that continues to this day. To understand the Esprit, you must first understand Colin Chapman, the founder of Lotus.
You seem to be constantly giving yourself problems to solve. Are you a competitive man?
How do you mean a competitive man? I always like to succeed at anything I try to do, and I always feel that, yes, I suppose I am. I always like to try to do anything better than I see it being done before.
He started the company in 1952 with a £25 loan from his then-girlfriend and later wife Hazel to produce a car of his own design, which he then sold in kit form. Necessarily developed on a slim budget, early Lotus cars did more with less and established a pattern that still defines the company today. Lightweight was a critical tenet of this philosophy, and Chapman's views on the topic are legendary, surviving in quotes like, "More power makes you faster on straights. Less weight makes you faster everywhere." Equally important to lightweight were other technical innovations that arrived in the following decades, which included monocoque construction in race cars, the Chapman strut, composite construction, and pioneering modern aerodynamics in the form of increasing downforce via wings and later by ground effect. On the track, the cleverness of Lotus cars paid off, with 7 F1 manufacturers' championships, 6 drivers' titles, and a win at the Indy 500, all between 1963 and 1978.
Kim Clark crosses the finish line to win the 500 with a comfortable lead of more than 2 minutes. It is the culmination of 3 years of effort by car builder Colin Chapman, and he dances down the pits like a ballet artist as Clark drives the triumphant road to victory lane.
In 1966, Lotus moved to its current headquarters at the former RAF airfield at Hethel, building a state-of-the-art facility where Lotus cars would be engineered, built, and tested. The airfield also proved ideal for Chapman, an avid pilot, to fly himself elsewhere in England and to continental Europe for business trips and to attend races. In the same year, 1966, Lotus also released its first mid-engined road car, the Europa. Arriving a few months after the Lamborghini Miura, the Europa was one of the world's first mid-engine production cars. It was an implementation of a layout that Lotus pioneered in both Formula One and with their remarkable 1965 Indy 500 victory, which was not only the first mid-engine car to win there, but it was so dominant that no front-engine car has won the Indy 500 since. The Europa was diminutive and peculiar-looking and typically Lotus, thoughtfully combining bespoke and off-the-shelf components from other manufacturers such as Renault and Triumph. They came together in a compact and light car that drove well but was more suited to the tolerant motorsport enthusiast than the playboy seeking a glamorous car to be seen in. Lotus went public on the London Stock Exchange in 1968, and with a shiny new factory and the company's 3rd and 4th F1 championships in 1968 and 1970, Chapman felt it was time to move the company's road car offerings upmarket to reflect and continue the company's success.
But he's also a trailblazer in this modern, machine-dominated world. For such a man, motor racing, which is invention fired by competition, makes the perfect arena.
These plans consisted of 3 new cars, 2 front-engined and 1 mid-engine, the latter of which would become the Esprit. All 3 would be powered by a new engine whose development began in 1966 to replace the Ford-derived 4-cylinder, albeit with twin-cam Lotus head, which was available in basically every road-going Lotus of the 60s. The new engine, called the 907, was the first Lotus road car engine to be developed completely in-house and was bang up-to-date with all-aluminum construction, dual overhead camshafts, and most excitingly 4 valves per cylinder. This fully 15 years before the likes of Porsche, Mercedes, Ferrari, or Lamborghini introduced their 4-valve heads. In all its applications, the engine was mounted at a 45-degree slant, which kept the height of the power unit low and provided allowance for the 90-degree V8 evolution that was originally envisioned. The Type 907 engine debuted at the 1972 Geneva Motor Show and broke new ground. It also broke generally, a lot. Early versions were plagued with problems, including oil leaks, low oil pressure, and water pump failures. Fortunately for Lotus, they had foisted the first 907s on an outside car manufacturer called Jensen Healey, since their own Lotuses were not ready to enter production yet.
The Jensen Healey Sports reaches a speed of 120 miles an hour with a light alloy engine weighing only 275 pounds.
The tragic Jensen-Healey is a tale for another time, but the vision of a sophisticated new British engine for the new British sports car that could also meet stringent emission standards of the critical United States market seemed like a good idea at the time, especially for Lotus, who could iron out all of the 907's bugs in cars not wearing Lotus badges and sell more engines and thus spread the cost of tooling over more units. They did eventually fix the 907, but not before it doomed the Jensen-Healey. On the plus side, the new Lotuses got a really excellent power plant, one which made around 160 horsepower from its 2 liters and revved to 7,000 RPM thanks to its massively over-square dimensions, which gave space for big valves and allowed reasonable piston speeds at the relatively high redline. Of the 3 Lotus cars to receive the new engine, the mid-engined Esprit was the most exciting. The Lotus board approved the project in July of 1970, and in 1971 Lotus's head of road car design arranged a meeting at the Turin Motor Show between Colin Chapman and the legendary Italian designer Giorgetto Giugiaro. Lotus had already been working with Giugiaro's firm Italdesign on the interior of the front-engined Elite, and wanted to engage him to give the new flagship the exciting wedge look as typified by Giugiaro's striking 1971 Maserati Boomerang concept car. They reached an agreement that the car would debut in concept form at the following year's Turin Motor Show, which is exactly what happened right around the time that Lotus clinched both the 1972 Formula One manufacturers and drivers' titles. To facilitate the collaboration, Lotus rented an apartment in Turin and thus began regular flights between Hethel and Turin several times a week, usually piloted by Chapman himself in the company plane. The spirit of the entire project was intense. All-nighters were frequent and countless problems were creatively solved, ranging from how to get the stunning show car looks, originally rendered in metal, to translate to production-ready fiberglass, to which transmission to use. Productionization was time-consuming, taking more than 2 years, but the result was well-resolved and, critically, true to the stunning looks of the 1972 concept car. The backbone chassis was an expansion of the Europas, while front suspension was adapted from the Opel Ascona, providing a thoroughly modern combination of double wishbones and disc brakes, which were paired with a manual rack and pinion steering system. At the back, lower suspension links were by trailing arm, while the drive shafts doubled as upper links to reduce complexity and weight. The 5-speed manual transaxle was sourced from Citroën's front-wheel drive SM, whose engine thankfully rotated backwards and thus ensured that it did not give the Esprit 5 reverse gears and one forward one when swapped around for installation amidships. The Esprit was designed from the outset to meet US crash and emission standards, a tough task that reflected both the engineering and commercial brainpower at Lotus, since the US market was essential to the model's success. In both US and European trims, the Esprit was hundreds of pounds lighter than its rivals such as the Porsche 911, both in terms of curb weight and sale price, although contemporary magazines still called it expensive despite it costing 20% less than a 911. Although the Esprit received a conventional press launch, most consumers met it in the 1977 James Bond movie The Spy Who Loved Me, rather than on the pages of magazines. This was a massive PR coup achieved in typically plucky Lotus fashion, not through an expensive placement, but by paying £1 to the doorman at Pinewood Studios, where the film was being shot, to park the car where it would be seen by executives coming and going. Eventually, they arranged a meeting with Lotus, and the car was written into a role that saw the submersible Esprit become one of the most recognizable movie cars of all time. 4 years later, Mr. Bond drove a pair of Esprit turbos in For Your Eyes Only. The experience of the early Esprit, even without all of the optional MI6 extras, is surprising. Its looks, inside and out, are so evocative of the early wedge era, possessing an arresting purity. Aside from the lip under the nose to reduce lift, the exterior is essentially free of excrescences, vents, or scoops. Its clean, unfussy execution contrasts with the hilariously kitschy interior, complete with gathered faux velour and almost shag carpeting, all presented in nearly every imaginable shade of brown. Early Esprit buyers could also choose an equally outrageous, and no less 1970s, tartan upholstery scheme. In the earliest Esprits, like this one, magnificent green instruments make every check of the car's vitals a cause for celebration because they are so cool looking. The explicitness of the car's 1970s aesthetic makes it impossible to approach the car without thinking about the reputation that British cars of this era, especially Lotuses, have for fragility and marginal quality. Imagine the shock then that the first impression while underway is of remarkable solidity and an almost complete absence of rattles. Sure, the quality of the detailing could be higher, but as the driver passes more time with the car, the skepticism of the initial approach evolves into admiration for what a well-rendered driver's car it is. The engine starts easily enough and once warm, idles happily, albeit with a charming coarseness that makes the whole car rock gently on its yaw axis like an enthusiastic puppy. Period magazines complained universally about the placement of the handbrake, which is very much in the way, while the narrow pedal box requires considered operation by drivers with big feet. The clutch is progressive and intuitive, effectively disappearing from the driver's consciousness. The gear change is genuinely excellent, with short, precise throws and a slick mechanical feel, which coupled with great synchromesh gives the transaxle a modern feel that inspires confidence. The linear and responsive throttle means that running through the gears, whether accelerating or heel-toeing down into second gear for a tight corner, comes naturally. Brakes are also excellent, with good bite and impressive stopping power, adding to the remarkably modern feel shared by most of the controls. The twin carburetors, large valve area, and short stroke give the engine a snappy responsiveness that makes it feel like an Alpha twin cam or a more textured NA Miata engine, rather than the low-revving four-cylinder units of other British sports cars like MGs, Triumphs, and Austin Healys. It's an engine that must be revved to make any meaningful amount of power or torque, and it is a willing, playful thing with a ton of charm and character. The power and weight of the car are surprisingly similar to a Miata from 20 or 30 years later, and thus the Series 1 Esprit responds best to being treated as an old-fashioned momentum car. Fortunately, the steering and chassis make this driving approach a pleasure. The steering wheel itself is not only ugly, but also uncomfortable thanks to the sharp edges of the center pad that makes resting one's thumbs on it unpleasant, but what it's connected to makes directing the Esprit down a twisty road a joy. The unassisted steering is precise, informative, and weights up in corners in a way that reassuringly telegraphs how hard the front end is working. The back end follows the front, although a pleasant degree of throttle adjustability is present and allows the driver to change the car's line with both hands and feet. The ride quality is sensational, with a combination of fluidity, body control, and ground clearance that makes even the most tortuous roads fun. Fun is a defining ingredient of any Lotus, but what the Esprit added was iconic world-class design coupled with a sophistication that made the car desirable not just to the fringe sports car nut, but to the more mainstream car enthusiast as well. The concept had incredible staying power, production lasted a shocking 28 years, and by the end of its run the Esprit offered every bit as much performance as a 993 Turbo or F355. By then the Esprit had grown heavier in a way that Chapman may not have approved of, but the model lived long enough to see the introduction of a new Lotus that reinstated the light, simple, clever ethos that underpinned the first Esprit all those years before. The Elise arrived in 1996, and Colin Chapman would have been proud had he lived long enough to see it. Chapman died suddenly at age 54 in 1982, making the Esprit the last Lotus road car whose development he oversaw. After his death, Lotus never won another F1 championship and retired from Grand Prix altogether after 1994. Fittingly, his legacy, in the form of the Esprit, sustained the company through these tough years, long enough for the Elise to not just arrive, but to surpass the impressive 10,000-unit Esprit production run by a factor of 3, thus laying the groundwork for the rebirth of Lotus products which we still enjoy today.